Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 500 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so thrilled to have neurologist and author Pria Anand with us to talk about her debut book called The Mind Electric, a neurologist on the strangeness and wonder of our brains. Hi, Pria.
Hi, Brandon. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. Everybody is super excited to get started. Before we do that, though, there's some housekeeping that I like to get out of the way that keeps everything running smoothly, and then we'll dive right in. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, so thank you for submitting those. But during the talk, you can also click the questions button that's just below the live stream video. Actually, I think that those might have changed. That live view might have changed, so they're on the side now. But it still says questions. Click the questions button. You can submit questions at any time, including now if you already have one formulated. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we'll get to as many questions as time allows. And don't worry if you have to leave early for any reason whatsoever. There will be a link to the recording sent out in about 24 hours for all registrants. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Pria Anand is a neurologist at the Boston Medical Center and an assistant professor at the Boston University School of Medicine. She's a graduate of Yale University and Stanford Medical School, and she trained in neurology, neuroinfectious diseases, and neuroimmunology at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and the Massachusetts General Hospital. Again, welcome. We are so happy to have you here. How are you today?
Thank you so much for having me. I am doing well here. I'm not as muggy here as I'm sure it is for you in New Orleans, but I'm so excited for this because it feels like such a joy and a treat to be speaking in front of an audience of readers.
Well, it's such a joy and a treat to have you here with us to talk about your beautiful book. Before I dive in and start gushing about it, though, can you give everybody kind of a quick summary? Because I know it's like part memoir and kind of a historical overview. So can you tell us about your book?
Absolutely. So it is, I'll start by saying that it has been a real struggle to come up with an elevator pitch for this book because it covers a huge amount of ground, both geographically and historically. But essentially the book is about the stories that we use to make meaning of our world and how they come to bear on illness and bodies. So one of the sort of starting points and inspirations for the book was I'm a neurologist and I sometimes care for people who have lost something. So who have lost their memory, who have lost their vision, who have lost their strength. And in the process of losing something, I was so struck by observing that many people gain something else, which is that their brains start to construct stories to explain the information or the details about the world that they're missing. So for instance, if someone loses their memory, their brain will sometimes construct really elaborate stories to explain why they're in the hospital, why they feel the way that they do, why they what the details of their life story are. One of my favorite questions to ask someone who's missing their memory is, have we met before and how? And I've gotten answers from, you were my high school sweetheart, to we're both here to watch the big football game, to I'm here in this building for my wedding. Really kind of remarkable, detailed stories that any novelist would envy. And I think when I first observed this happening, I thought, what a strange feature of neurologic disease. And then I think sort of the longer that I have been practicing neurology, the more that I've realized that every time that someone has a particular neurologic symptom, it tells us something universal about all of our brains. And in this case, that symptom, which is called confabulation, tells us something all of our brains are designed to tell stories. Our brains are really kind of storytelling machines, and stories are how we navigate our world. So that's the starting point for the book, and it explores all of the different stories that we use to make sense of illness and disease, whether we're people experiencing illness, people treating illness, or people just living in bodies and living in the world.
So you intertwine your own stories within the whole book, but you also, especially, and you set it up in that introduction, fables and confabulations, like you just said, you set it up that introduces readers to the idea that science, medicine, mythology, and magic are kind of all intertwined and have been for quite some time. And it's so beautifully done. And within that, you talk about your own path into neurology. And Juanita from Alexandria Library wants to know what or who influenced you to become a neurologist. Can you tell us that story and kind of your inspiration for the book as it is?
Thank you so much for that lovely question, Juanita. So I started at medical school. I loved every rotation that I did. Every sort of new service in the hospital felt like something really appealing to me. But just at the moment that I was just trying to decide what kind of doctor I wanted to be, across the world in India, my grandfather fell ill. And he was this really remarkable figure in my childhood. He was really kind of this larger than life person who had spent most of his life in India, but in the 40s, he had sort of somehow charmed his way onto an American troop ship, bringing soldiers home after the war, and spent 2 years in LA learning to make films, and then went back to India and made films for the Indian government, and had all of these incredible stories about his travels and about his work and about his life. He started to fall sick in his 90s. And the most striking thing was that, again, he had been this really larger than life figure in my childhood. And he started to almost dwindle away. So his muscles started to vanish. His voice, he'd always been this really strong personality, and his voice started to become weaker. He had always been incredibly active, and he suddenly sort of was not able to get out of his chair to kind of leave the apartment in the morning. And I was so kind of struck by watching this transformation happen. And I was a medical student at that time. I was just starting my 4th and last year of medical school. And I went with my grandfather to the neurologist, and the neurologist undressed him and examined him and looked at each of his muscles and showed me the way that his muscles were moving. They were sort of quivering like worms in a bag, or like snakes in a bag. And the neurologist explained that those were kind of the dying gasps of his muscle fibers. And just by examining him, the neurologist was able to ascertain that my grandfather was suffering from post-polio syndrome, which was the echo of an infection he'd had in childhood. He grew up in a very, very, very rural part of North India, where he grew up without underground sanitation. He left school at 14 and worked in a cotton gin factory under conditions where he got malaria just about every year, and also contracted polio, and had spent his life having recovered from that infection with just a limp as kind of a reminder that he'd had it. But as he got older, his body stopped being able to compensate as well for the muscles he had lost as part of his childhood infection. And he developed this resurgence of his childhood polio symptoms. And I sort of was of two minds, in the sense that my grandfather was wasting away, and it was really kind of heartbreaking. You know, he had a wonderful life, and he lived to kind of see his grandchildren grow up and had an incredible life. It was hard to watch this really larger than life figure sort of waste away. But I also thought I was so struck by this idea that his whole life, his childhood, even his future, the way that his voice would evolve, the way that his body would continue to waste away, all of that was written into his muscles. And just by examining him, this neurologist could know something more intimate about him than his own granddaughter, knew. And that just moved me so profoundly. So I came back to the United States, and actually that was the year that I decided I wanted to become a neurologist, because I was so fascinated with this idea of someone's story being written into their body, and also by the way that the way that illness could really change the course trajectory of someone's story. I knew I wanted to somehow be a part of that, or start to understand it better. So that moment and my grandfather really inspired me to become a neurologist, and I never looked back after that.
Mm-hmm. So I keep thinking, you keep saying, you know, he's super charming, he was a larger than life character, and I keep thinking of that little anecdote that you put in about his picture with Cary Grant and meeting your grandmother.
Yes, that is my absolute favorite. So he got to visit the set of RKO Studios, and there's a Cary Grant movie called Mr. Blandings Built His Dream House, which is like a movie about moving to the suburbs. And he got to visit that set. He has a picture of himself with Cary Grant, and he was like a very tall, handsome man. They both had like brilliantined hair and were both beautifully coiffed. And there's a picture of him standing next to Cary Grant. And he famously, when he first met my grandmother, showed her this picture and said, "Can you tell who is me and who is Cary Grant?" And my grandmother was so charmed that they were married like a week later. And that's still enshrined in our family mythology.
I love that. Well, Speaking of mythology, in that introduction, you also talk a lot about kind of your own introduction to fables through your sister's storytelling, and you use a lot of fables and mythology, and even spirituality throughout the book to explain kind of what we've told ourselves about what's happening in the world, even before the medicine was ready to show us. What made you connect those two things?
So I think especially when I was a medical student, you're just starting to get inculcated in sort of the jargon and the language of medicine. But you realize when you meet people who are struggling with illness that people and communities have all of these really complex ways of understanding illness that kind of predate or encompass the medical explanations that we can offer. And sometimes I think there's a truth to those mythologies and folklores that the medicine can't quite capture. So I'll give you one of my favorite examples, which maybe some people on the call have experienced this because it's a very common symptom. It's the example of sleep paralysis. I don't know, Brandon, if you've ever had the experience of sleep paralysis.
Or my husband does.
Oh my gosh. It is this. So I'm sure that he's told you about what a frightening experience it can be. The sensation of being trapped in your body just as you're falling asleep or waking up, and having the sensations of dreams. So a looming figure, shadowy figure in the distance, strange footfalls, sometimes the sensation that you're floating outside of your body, a weight on your chest, but still being fully awake. So sleep paralysis happens because of essentially like a molecular glitch. It's a problem with the switch between falling asleep and waking up. And I could tell you something about what is happening in your spinal cord or your brainstem when you experience sleep paralysis. I could tell you which molecules are at play, but your husband would probably tell me that totally misses the point of this otherworldly, supernatural, terrifying experience. It misses what is like larger than life and all consuming about our bodies and about illness and symptoms. But because sleep paralysis is so common, something like 1 in 5 people will experience it at some point in their lives. Every cultural tradition has a story to explain it. So there is a jealous witch or a sorcerer or a man who grants you a wish or an unsettled spirit or a creature who sits on your chest. And I would argue that those descriptions get at something about the phenomenology. Everyone describes the sensation of something on their chest, this kind of like looming figure. Those are universals of the experience of sleep paralysis. And I think those folklores and mythology tell us something true about that experience that the science doesn't. And I sort of think you need both to really understand that experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that ties in perfectly to your next chapter, which is the theater of illness, and talking about medicine and performance, basically. So I know that you open this section with a young woman that you've cared for, and she's believing herself struck blind by God as punishment. Can you talk us through that story a little bit and why you decided to open with that for this chapter?
Absolutely. So, I think that chapter was really about the stakes of stories, because I think when you go to a hospital, so much hinges on whether or not the doctor who's hearing you or the nurse who's hearing you believes your story or attends to the details of your story. And I wanted to try and illustrate that. So the story that opens that chapter is, it's a story about a young woman who I first met when I was a medical student. We were very close in age, and she had the experience of losing her vision pretty abruptly in both of her eyes. And the sort of medical explanation was that she had a disease that's similar to multiple sclerosis that had affected the optic nerves carrying information from her eyes into her brain. But her explanation was that she had grown up in a really religious community. She'd had her first kiss not long before the blindness struck, and she believed that she had been struck blind for the kiss. And there was a relationship between there may have been a relationship between the kiss and the blindness. One of the infections that may have kind of set off the cascade of inflammation that caused her symptoms was Epstein-Barr virus, which causes mononucleosis, which we sometimes can be transferred from one person to another for kissing, but many, many other ways. But she had this really kind of specific spiritual explanation for what had happened to her. She was really searching for a way to make sense of her symptoms and why it had happened. And that was kind of what she had settled on. And her story has stayed with me for a long time for many reasons. One, I think one was that when I first heard her story, she said that she had been struck blind and she felt like it was some sort of a punishment. I think it was hard for me to understand the biology of what happened. I had never before seen someone struck blind so sort of quickly. And I, as a medical student, I hadn't seen very much at all, but it was a symptom that I didn't quite understand. And I wondered, could it have been related to kind of the stress that she felt like she had done something wrong and then experienced blindness, but it was really something physical that was happening that was causing her symptoms. And I think this idea of stories mattering, a diagnosis hinging on a story, I think one of the recurring themes I wanted to highlight in the book is how that kind of can resonate differently for different people and for communities that are sometimes marginalized by medicine. I think women are much more likely to have autoimmune diseases like the one that this woman was experiencing, and sometimes to have diseases where the symptoms can fluctuate, so kind of come and go. And I think medicine has a long history of maybe not hearing the stories of women as seriously or honoring them as to the same extent that they do kind of the broader community. So her story stuck with me. It was really profound to see all these two different ways of explaining the same symptoms.
Mm-hmm. That makes me think about, so in this chapter, you also introduce the readers to Charcot, who literally creates a theater for his patients, who are all female, to kind of perform almost like a type of a circus freak show almost. And it wasn't just for the medical community. I was shocked to read that like people in the community in general could come in and watch. When you were doing research, was this something that you knew going in, or was this something that you uncovered in your research? Because a lot of these diseases seem to be predominantly female, at least in the history.
Yes, that's such a wonderful, thank you so much for bringing up that story, because it is fascinating and I could talk for a full hour about Charcot and the Salpêtrière. People on the call who speak French, please disregard my pronunciation. But I was familiar with the name Charcot because his name is part of so many medical eponyms. There's so many syndromes that are named after Charcot. Charcot-Marie-Tooth syndrome, Charcot-Wilbrand syndrome. So I knew the name and sort of had this vague sense of the history. He's described as the father of modern neurology because he did all these very, very detailed sort of pathologic autopsy studies to understand illness and diseases like multiple sclerosis. Kind of, we owe our understanding to Charcot. But exactly as you said, he practiced at the Salpêtrière, which was a Parisian, essentially an asylum. So women who were sick, sometimes simply just old, pregnant, out of wedlock, were sent to this asylum and often lived their whole lives there. And Charcot he viewed this place is incredibly precious because he got to see people living their whole lives with neurologic illness in one place. And then when they died, he sort of laid claim to their bodies and tried to understand what in their brain or their spinal cord had caused their symptoms. He created this theater, and he would do, it was called the Sunday morning lessons, where he would bring a patient on stage and he would describe her symptoms and have her essentially perform her illness. He would put his patients in these really elaborate costumes. He would sometimes put feathered headdresses on them so that if they had a tremor or their head was moving in a particular way, the feathers would undulate and the people in the back row of the audience could see the movements more clearly. And it was not just exactly as you said, it wasn't just students and doctors. There are stories about Parisian actresses coming to see these performances to try and emulate the range of emotions that all of these sick patients were performing on the stage. And wow. I feel so conflicted about this history because there are obviously such, there are all of these violations that are inherent in this history. There's also this way in which we understand that multiple sclerosis is an anatomic physical disease and not a manifestation of something like hysteria because of Charcot's patients and because he had the opportunity to study these poor women who were housed at this asylum. So it's a very, very complicated history. And I think that legacy kind of stays with neurology now.
Mm-hmm. Is there something, Alan from Cuyahoga County Public Library, saying, what has fascinated you about the human brain and why, professionally and personally, if you're willing to express it? But I guess also on top of that, what was something that you uncovered in your research that was very surprising and you had no idea?
Many, many things. I loved the process of researching this book. I think it's made me a better neurologist because I think spending time with medical history really highlights, I think, as we reading kind of the stories of physicians from the 19th and 17th centuries. First of all, there are so many, they're so descriptive. So I knew the name Charcot, but one of the things I got to do in writing this book was actually find all of his original lectures and see exactly what he was saying to those audiences. And there's so much contained there that cannot be captured by, the summaries or the eponyms today. But I think what was really precious about spending time with the medical history was that it was just profoundly humbling. I think it's easy when you practice in a contemporary hospital to say, like, people are using folklore and mythology to understand disease, but we really understand it. We really know what's going on. And I think it takes just a few instances of looking at, 19th century medical texts to say, oh my gosh, 100 years from now, people are going to look at what I believed about disease and say, what was she thinking? I have one example. I'll give you just one example that didn't actually make it into the book. Unfortunately, I hope to write a whole book about this example, but in my corner of the world in New England, where I live now, there was in the 18th century, there was kind of this plague of consumption, so tuberculosis, that would ravage communities, and especially kind of small farming communities in New England. And there was a belief in communities at that time that consumption was caused by the spirit of someone dead sucking the blood and the life force like a vampire from their living relatives. And so people had this belief because they had observed that consumption clustered in particular homes and families. They watched people waste away from it. It looked like the life force was being sucked from their bodies. It seemed like one family member would die and then the next one would get sick. So they observed certain features of the disease and they came up with this explanation. And what is so fascinating to me about that is that if you look at the medical texts from the time, doctors are saying these New England villagers, they don't know anything. They have all this folklore. But at the same time, doctors were sending their patients to like the depths of caves or the tops of mountains or the seashore to get sea air to dry out their lungs to treat consumption, because doctors were telling a different story that was a little bit more complicated, that used medical jargon, but was also just a story to try and understand this disease and come up with ways to treat it. And it's so valuable to see those two examples, kind of contemporaneous examples, because I think it is humbling and it reminds me that like there's a value to all of these different ways of making sense of illness. And I think in the future, someone may be telling a different story about the illnesses that I now treat, although I do believe that they will still be telling stories regardless of what those stories are.
Well, that story makes me think of the story with the physician who discovered how infectious diseases are spread from person to person with the cadavers. And then he himself was put in an insane asylum.
That is it's an incredible story about this Hungarian obstetrician. So I'm a neurologist and a lot of the book is about neurology, but I think it's hard for me to separate neurology from the rest of the body. The story is about a Hungarian obstetrician who practiced at this clinic in Vienna where he was delivering babies, and this clinic was plagued by something called childbed fever. So women and their children were dying of this horrible fevering illness. No one knew what it was, what caused it. And there were two clinics that were housed at the same hospital, and one was staffed by doctors and students, and the other was staffed by midwives. And the clinic staffed by doctors had a much higher rate of this childbed fever than the clinic staffed by midwives. And he eventually realized that it was because the doctors would spend their mornings doing autopsies on people who had passed away, and then their afternoons delivering babies. And they were carrying what he called cadaverous particles from the autopsies into the delivery room. And the midwives just attended to women in labor, never did autopsies. And so their patients were not dying. And he was horrified that his hands had caused this devastating illness among his patients. And so he really advocated for hand washing. And at the time, everyone was like, this guy is crazy. What's he saying? That doctors' hands are diseased? It's horrible. So he got kicked out of this particular clinic. He set up another one, and the medical establishment wouldn't accept hand washing as something that could save the lives of patients for years.
Despite the fatalities declining.
Despite exactly, like, he brought the rate of childbed fever way down just by washing his hands after he did an autopsy. I mean, it's a wild story. And he was eventually, he wrote all these angry letters to medical journals saying, like, we're allowing our patients to die of this thing we can prevent, and no one published them. And he was ultimately committed to an asylum by his colleagues who thought that he had lost his mind, and he died of the same infection that in this asylum that he had been describing among his patients. So really, like, I think the history of science is full of all of these examples of people really clinging to the stories that they know, rather than being open to new ones.
And where did you do a lot of this research? Were you in medical libraries, university archives?
Yes. So I relied extremely heavily on libraries for this research. I feel so lucky that there are still places that have all of these original old texts, because I think they're so rich and detailed. So a lot of this research came from the BU Medical Library. There's a wonderful librarian there, Florina Tynanova, who is an incredible interlibrary loan specialist. And I would send her these messages like in the middle of the night. I was like, I need this Dutch manuscript about the cerebellum from 1862. Can you find it? And somehow she always did. So I am hugely grateful that there are still physical places that house this history that are open to the public, that people can access.
Big lover of libraries here. You're in the right. Right at full circle. Okay, so you talked earlier about sleep paralysis, and in your chapter "Sleep No More," the chapter is kind of, the through thread is based on this rare genetic neurological disorder where the person cannot sleep, and you use the folklore of Undine's curse to introduce us to that. But what you're talking about isn't sleep paralysis. It's a completely different disorder. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So there are a few different sort of, the chapter sort of is on the theme of kind of sleep and wakefulness and all of the gray area between those two things. And it uses, to kind of illustrate that, a few different illnesses, among them something that is eponymously called Undine's curse, as well as sleep paralysis, something else called fatal familial insomnia, so many different ways of sleeping and not sleeping.
Yeah. Okay. So Undine's curse, though, why did you choose to use that folklore to introduce us to the concept of sleeping and not sleeping?
So so many of your viewers may have encountered the story of Undine or Undine in different forms, because it's been a play, a ballet, it's been, the kind of the stuff of many movies and novels. But the story is essentially that there's this sort of water spirit nymph kind of goddess named Undine, and she falls in love with a mortal man, and she becomes mortal to be with him. But becoming mortal means that she's no longer completely preserved. So she starts to age. And as she starts to age, he starts to stray and he has all these affairs. And she is so furious that she's given up all of herself to be with this person, that she curses this mortal man. And the curse that she levies on him is that he has to stay awake, because if he falls asleep, he will forget to breathe. He has to stay awake to remember to breathe, and he can't fall asleep. And there are neurological conditions that can do the same thing. It's devastating, this idea that you need things like breath have to be under your conscious control. But I'm so fascinated by that story, because I felt like, in my medical residency, I would often work like 28-hour shifts. And I was so fascinated by that story, because it's something different than insomnia. This idea that you can be exhausted and your body can be ready to slip into sleep, and you're forcing yourself to stay awake. Yeah. So I heard that story at the end of like a 28-hour shift, and I was like, I empathize with this cursed man, So I felt like I was experiencing this weird gray area between being asleep and being awake, every 4 days when I worked these long call shifts.
One of another piece of amazing medical history that you give us there is the introduction or the birth of those long shifts by William Halsted, and how he was kind of the person who started all of that. All of his surgeons had to stay, what was it, like 48 hours or something like that, something crazy. Why was the William Halsted important for you to include in this? Because it's still something that the medical industry does today, correct? And we know that it's not good.
It is still a hallmark of medical training today. We expect our doctors in training to be able to function without sleep, and we've spun it different ways, but it always comes back to being.
And his ending and the reason he was staying awake wasn't even like yeah.
It's a wild story. There are two. So this story resonated with me in particular because I did my medical training at Johns Hopkins, which is where William Halsted practiced for many years and where he developed the idea of medical residency. So there were two physicians at Johns Hopkins. One was William Osler. The other one was William Halsted, both named William. And between the two of them, they came up with this idea of residency. So Osler was the first one to call his trainees residents because they had to live at the hospital for the entire duration of their 8-year training. They were not allowed to marry because they were supposed to be like devoted entirely to their patients and to the hospital. So they were called residents because they were literally in residence at the hospital. And then Halsted famously functioned without sleep. Like at one point he worked at 6 or 7 different hospitals and would operate every night and run a clinic every day. And he expected his trainees to do the exact same thing, to function without sleep. And he had this kind of pyramid model where a bunch of people would start out in training, and every year this hardship of having to work all of these hours would weed out first one resident and then another, and only the strongest would kind of survive and graduate. And it's wild because we learned long after he died, and about a decade ago, we learned that William Halsted had been a cocaine addict, and that had been the reason he was able to function without sleep for all of those years. It was like not unusual for doctors at the time to experiment with different anesthetics, and cocaine was the newest one. So he had this reputation of kind of inhuman endurance, and we learned later that it made sense that he wasn't able to do it on his own, but that legacy is still stuck. It's so hard to change a system once it's deeply entrenched into kind of our vision of medical training. So it is a wild story, and I think I introduced a lot of problems in the book without solutions. I don't have a great suggestion for how we change it, but it is so fascinating to me that we cling to this idea that being able to function without sleep is important for doctors, when really the only reason this guy was able to do it was because he was using cocaine.
Yeah. It's wild to me. It was wild to read that. You in that section too, and other sections, are very honest about your own experiences and thoughts, especially with lack of sleep. Were you worried that your own honesty throughout the memoir about how you felt about whether or not a patient lived or died because you were too tired to care, basically, were you worried about any backlash about that?
Yes. So, I mean, it was honestly, I think even writing about that is difficult it feels difficult for me to admit to myself. And it felt difficult at the time for me to admit to myself the ways that being exhausted really affected the kind of human that I was. Like, I feel like in order to become a doctor, I was having to kind of sacrifice some of the parts of humanness. And I think there is I feel like it's this medical training feels like this double-edged sword, because on the one hand, you need to be exposed to enough ways of suffering and enough death that you can anticipate it and that you can know how to treat it, and that you can, in the moment that it happens, not be nervous or frozen. But I think human beings also, when they're exposed to something enough times, they stop realizing how horrible or heartbreaking or remarkable it is. So I really thought a lot about the ways that my medical training had transformed me on that front, both, I think, important and terrible. And it was important to me to be honest about that, and about all of the many, many mistakes that I've made in the course of my medical practice and training. And I don't think I could have written the book without being honest about that, but it's hard for me even sometimes to admit to myself.
Mm-hmm. What kind of frame of mind were you in when you were writing? Like, what was your writing process? When did you start writing this book?
So some of the pieces of the book I started decades ago. So there's a section that takes place on an island in Colombia, in the Caribbean, that I wrote while I was living on that island. I was there during the rainy season, and when it was pouring rain, I would sit on my covered veranda and record voice notes, and that eventually became the basis of that chapter. So some of the stories I started writing many, many years ago and sort of have accumulated magpie-like over the years. But I started writing in earnest towards a book about 6 weeks after I gave birth to my first child. I was not sleeping. It really felt like an echo of my medical training and of lots of experiences that I had sort of blocked out, and I wrote the chapter on sleep. And then the book actually sold about 2 weeks before I gave birth to my second child. And I started writing the day after I came home from the hospital. It was winter in Boston, so I wasn't like going anywhere anyways. And I wrote, my second, I had a newborn who was nursing every 2 hours. And so I felt like this real urgency to write, where I had to get all of my thoughts down in the next hour and 59 minutes before my kid woke up or before the toddler started screaming. So it was a really strange kind of sleepless period that I wrote the book in almost kind of a manic frenzy. But it came out of me at a moment when I felt like my body was going through a wild transition, and I wanted to capture what that felt like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you can feel the rawness there when you do talk about those things. So thank you for sharing that. Kim from Wallingford Public Library says, have you had an experience yourself that led you to the fascination of the brain and its complexities? And this makes me think of the Soundless Hum chapter.
Yes. So I think one of the things I wanted to capture is, I think we imagine that there's this like really stark binary between like illness, neurologic illness, and functional brains. And I think there's actually this huge gray area, and people can experience all kinds of idiosyncrasies of our brains without experiencing the kind of the really kind of profound experience of neurologic illness. So one of the examples I gave in the book was when I was in my last year of residency, I started to develop this really strange symptom, which is that I was hearing a whooshing in my ear every time that I lay down and every time that I coughed or sneezed. And I ignored it for months and months. And then finally, one of my co-residents noticed that I was sleeping propped up on pillows in the call room, because every time I lay flat, I would hear this deafening whooshing. And I wound up sort of getting it checked out and understanding that it was a result of a malformation of some of the veins in my brain. But the experience I would never say that it sort of matches the experience of my patients in terms of the kind of how profound or how difficult it is, but it just was this like glimpse of how our brains can change our perception, how we can have symptoms that totally preoccupy us. And that experience will kind of forever change how I think about patients who describe the experience of hearing things that no one else can hear.
Mm-hmm. Well, that chapter too also starts to kind of cover those hallucinations and as being a precursor to even seizures. And Elizabeth from Montgomery County Library says, can you mention something about infrequent audio hallucinations and how they do present as a precursor to a seizure, and why?
Yes. So there are many different things that can cause people experiencing sort of phantom sounds. Even the experience of losing your hearing can cause your brain to produce sounds, because our brains are so designed to listen for words and conversation and to communicate. But one of the kind of strangest manifestations of seizures. So seizures happen when there's kind of abnormal electrical activity in the brain. And what a seizure looks like depends on where in the brain that electrical activity happens. And just by some curious twist of biology, one of the parts of the brain that's most prone to seizures is the temporal lobe, where our auditory cortex lives. And sometimes people who have a seizure in that part of the brain will have either a kind of a strain of music or a particular voice or a particular constellation of words that comes before what they experience as their seizure, or sometimes is their entire seizure. And you can imagine that there are lots of people who go to doctors and say, I'm hearing these 3 chords of this particular song again and again and again. And doctors say, great, what do you want me to do about it? Because it's not something that's outwardly manifest that people can look at and know is a seizure, but can be a manifestation of a seizure in a particular part of the brain.
Mm-hmm. That also kind of makes me think of the performance aspect of medicine. Is like, you go in to have these symptoms, you tell the doctor, but you're not performing your symptoms in the correct way, so they never do the neuro consult.
That's exactly right. I think we've in some ways come a ways since Charcot, but in other ways we really still ask people to make a performance out of their symptoms.
So another thing that you talk about in that chapter is seizures stopping during pregnancy. And that kind of it kind of is juxtaposed to later chapters when you talk about pregnancy actually changing your brain and your body so much that it can cause other maladies. So why do seizures stop during pregnancy, and what does change with the brain and the body? I mean, of course, other than growing the child, that causes potential neurological issues during pregnancy.
Yes. So seizures. So there's a type of epilepsy called catamenial epilepsy. So some women experience an epilepsy that has this really clear monthly cycle where the fluctuations in their hormones can provoke seizures. And when they become pregnant, they're not experiencing that monthly flux, and their seizures can kind of abate or go into remission. But there are other kinds of syndromes like eclampsia that cause seizures only during pregnancy. And I think pregnancy is an example of what I said earlier about that there's not really this binary between a normal body and a body that is ill or suffering, because I think pregnancy exists in this kind of vast gray area of a strange experience within our bodies that we don't categorize as illness. I think pregnancy is this wild transformation where as you're growing a fetus, your body is funneling nutrients to that fetus, and there's this sort of constant tension or sort of this kind of constant push and pull between the needs of an adult woman's body and the needs of the growing fetus. So it can give rise to all kinds of strange symptoms, but one of the curious side effects is that certain illnesses like catamenial epilepsy or even like multiple sclerosis that have a hormonal component to them can actually abate during pregnancy.
That's so interesting. So I know that you wanted to do a short reading of one of your chapters. Do you want to go ahead and do that now?
Yes, perfect. I will. So I will read a couple of paragraphs from a chapter that talks a little bit about some of the transformations of pregnancy.
Okay.
So this is from chapter 5, Inquietude. I first became pregnant at the height of the pandemic, when runners gasped behind their N95 masks and enough offices closed that even highway traffic slowed. At the time, my city seemed to be peopled mostly by flocks of wild turkeys. The turkeys wandered slowly from sidewalk to median, sheltering only occasionally under the awnings of boarded-up businesses in the rain, and otherwise perpetually driven to motion. They were ludicrous, reptilian heads and beady eyes bound incongruously to soft, fat bodies and tufts of decorative feathers. Rarely, a car would pass, and a tom would race after it, senselessly chasing his own reflection in the fender as if it were an intruding male. Once, I saw a hen trapped in the revolving front door of the downtown hospital where I work, spinning in slow, confused circles, hypnotized by the emergency room lights mirrored in the glass. In the void left by frightened, housebound humanity, wildlife everywhere seemed emboldened, freed from the pockets of forest and jungle to which it had previously been confined and impatient to wander. In Istanbul, pods of sleek silver dolphins reclaimed the waters of the Bosphorus as the traffic of ferries slowed. In Santiago, pumas emerged from the mountains to lazily pad the sidewalks. And in Lima, flamingos swarmed the empty beaches like so many pink locusts in a plague. In those months, the animals seemed to find their way into my body. At doctor's appointments, I learned that my son had grown to the size of a ladybug or a mouse, a quail egg, or an ostrich egg. At my first ultrasound, the technician told me that the baby's heart was beginning to be forged, and I could imagine only a loose heart flapping wildly within my body like a trapped hummingbird, something entirely distinct from me that could take flight at any moment. But then I began to notice signs that my son and I were bound together, his existence marking my body with mounting evidence. There were my gums, which bled constantly. This, I learned, was from the extra blood coursing through my body, sticky and viscous, flowing into my son's swelling placenta. Despite the taste of iron contaminating all of my food, I was constantly tormented by a fathomless, savage hunger. At first, it alternated with devastating nausea, the two sometimes mingling in my confused abdomen until the thought of even the blandest food made me gag. When the nausea cleared, I was left ravenous. I craved grease and salt and the slick feeling of plasticky yellow cheese against my tongue. I'd been a vegetarian since childhood, but for the first time, I ordered a hamburger and chicken wings at a local burger chain, a notch above fast food. The cashier handed me 2 sets of disposable silverware, 2 packets of glossy red ketchup, assuming I was ordering for 2. I found myself wondering as I ate whether that was the moment my son's heart was beginning to form. In my dreams, my son's heart was made of ground beef, his blood the gleaming crimson of Heinz ketchup. Most of all, though, my body was marked by a new, torturous need to move that took hold when I lay down at night to sleep. The sensation of a rubber band coiling in each joint, tightly, tightly. The obstetrician called it restless legs, but it was so much more than that. A feeling I experienced in the most intimate of spaces, within my pelvis, between the vertebrae of my neck, nestling into the fine joints of my fingers. Pregnant, I moved ceaselessly, wandering the apartment at night like a sleepwalker, bruising my shins against the low coffee table and toppling chairs. In the morning, the cockeyed furniture charted my path like X's on a treasure map.
Thank you so much for reading that. The literary elements and the immersive scenes that you create throughout the book are so wonderful, so good, so well written. I feel like I'm there experiencing that with you. Have you always wanted to be a writer with this literary aspect?
I'm a pretty voracious reader, and actually long before I ever thought I wanted to be a doctor, I wanted to be a journalist.
Okay.
I really loved the idea that you could hear someone's story and sort of alchemize it into something that felt universal that other people could relate to. And I carried that with me into college. And when I sort of found my footing as a doctor, I think I really sort of saw that as an essential part of the kind of doctor I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So why did you choose to open with that personal story for this chapter?
Well, I really wanted to have sort of skin in the game. I didn't want this to be a book where I was talking about other people's experiences and pretending that I was some sort of like objective, removed observer. I also exist in a body. And I think, as I shared, I started writing this book in earnest after I gave birth to my first child. And one of the things that made me want to write it was the experience of pregnancy. I felt like my body was completely transforming. It felt totally out of my control. And, again, I was just catching this glimpse of the way that our bodies, the way that illness, the way that these kinds of physical transformations and journeys can really kind of take control of our stories. So it felt like a window for me into something that I think other people have experienced in their lives. And it really changed how I thought about doctoring. And I wanted so badly to sort of convey that to readers, my own experience. So it was really clear that I was writing a book, that I was giving as much of myself to this book as I was of anyone else.
Absolutely. I think it's incredibly effective. To me, it makes you a more authoritative narrator. I love to hear the personal glimpses. So I was a little alarmed to hear about a couple of hypotheses for deja vu. I know that's in a different chapter, but we do have a few people asking about deja vu. And so one of the hypotheses being that it represents a momentary discord between the two halves of the limbic system. And I feel like I have deja vu a couple times per year, and I always feel like it's a memory from a dream that I had. So Colleen from Calgary Public Library is asking, how does neuroscience explain deja vu?
So I'm going to start by saying the same thing that I say about so many different kinds of experiences, which is that we don't really know, but we have thoughts. So, so one of the theories is that our memories are formed in our hippocampi, which they're named for the Greek word for seahorses. And it's because they're sort of, if you look at them on a cross section of the brain, they're sort of curled like seahorses right on either side of our brain. We have one on each side. And one hypothesis is that memories are formed in these two structures, but it's possible that we might access a memory from one just before we access it from another, or a particular sensation might activate an old memory in one before it's activated in another, with the idea that somewhere below our kind of like conscious thought, that kind of dissonance between one hippocampus and the other gives us the sensation that we've experienced something before, even if the details are foreign to us. So that's what déjà vu is the sensation of, I've walked down the street before in exactly this order, or I've had this conversation before when actually we haven't. So something is calling on a memory that's stored in our brain and creating this kind of dissonance between the two halves of our brain and the two hippocampi that generates the sensation that we've experienced, sensation of familiarity, like we've experienced something before, even if the explicit details are new to us.
Okay. All right, so we're not magical. I'm not having like a premonition.
Well, that's another hypothesis. Yeah.
So that kind of, that in that same chapter, we are introduced to like Alzheimer's and dementia and things like that. And so Irene is saying, how does brain function change with aging? And Larry says, is there a way to keep your brain young?
That is I think that's a question that's probably resonant for a lot of people listening. So I'll start by saying, I think that we have this mistaken belief that as we age, it's all sort of downhill for our brains. And that's not true at all. Our brains evolve as we age, but in some ways our brains actually become stronger. So certain parts of our brain, certain parts of our memory, our sense of familiarity, some parts of our vocabulary and our language become more sophisticated as we age. But sort of the other thing that happens is that our parts of our brain kind of shrink as we age. And among those parts of our brain are some of the structures that help with our memory. And the way that we age depends on what's happening in our brains at that particular moment. But Alzheimer's disease is an example of a particular, of something that really changes the way that our brain ages, and that particularly has an affinity for those parts of the brain that store memory. So it's a type of dementia that tends to affect memory, can affect language, can sometimes affect visual perception very early on, and really change how people relate to their world and to their loved ones.
Mm-hmm. In that same chapter, you share a story about a woman who believes she's given birth to changelings, or that her children have been replaced. Melissa from Russell Library says, and she says, I'm writing this before your book is available, so forgive me. Would you consider something like a parent who believes her children are being stolen by fairies and replaced with changelings, or even perhaps teaching her children that they are in fact changelings, to be a form of child abuse that requires outside intervention? Or does this scenario involve a folk parenting style that might have a kind of medicinal value within its own community? After reading the book, we know, because the last part of her question is, what is the neurological explanation for a changeling? So after reading the book, we know that there was a neurological explanation for that story. Do you want to share that with us?
Yes, absolutely. So the particular story was of someone who experienced what's called a Capgras delusion, which is this idea that people experience the sensation that they believe that a loved one is being, often a loved one or someone close to them, is being replaced by an identical double. So they can say, this person has the exact nose of my child and the eyes of my child and the hair of my child, but it's a different person who doesn't feel familiar to me. And this particular woman was experiencing it as one of the first symptoms of her Alzheimer's disease. But the eponym comes from a French psychiatrist who cared for this woman who had 6 children, and 5 of them died. This was in the 19th century, at a time when dying in childbirth or children dying young was not uncommon. So the first 5 of them died. Only 1 survived to adulthood. And she believed that the child who survived was being replaced every single day by an identical double. And it was this really profound, it was such a profound belief that really alienated her from her loved ones. And that was something that I witnessed with the patient that I cared for as well. So there are many different neurological syndromes that can result in this particular type of belief or delusion. To the question about, in the particular case that I mentioned, I think that it was a really trying experience for this person's children. And I think it really speaks to the way that neurologic illness can shape not just the life of the person suffering it, but also the life and the life stories of their children and their other loved ones. And I think it's like variable. I think it really depends on what the situation is, what the story is that's being told, how old the children are in this particular case. When this belief set on, the children were actually were adults. Yeah. but is really, really striking thinking about how entire families are sometimes just totally changed by illness.
Yeah. I would imagine when you read fantasy fiction and there are these magical explanations for things, that is it hard for you to separate, like, oh no, I know what's happening here, you actually just have XYZ neurological disorder?
I am prone to making diagnoses where I shouldn't be making diagnoses, but I love all different kinds of fiction and literature, because I think I just have this like really expansive view of what real is, I think, because of my work.
Yeah, it just makes me think, because like you think of changelings, and there's a lot of folklore about changelings and a lot of fiction out there about changelings and shapeshifters and things like that. And so I'm trying to imagine Pria reading these and being like, no, actually, that's just your. So Angela from Harris County Public Library wants to know, does a brain tumor affect these narratives? How might a brain tumor manifest before being officially diagnosed?
Yes. So I'll say that what's really interesting about neurology is that often the question we're answering in neurology, before we're answering what a particular disease is, we're asking the question of where it is. So a brain tumor, so what I mean by that is that the symptoms someone experiences often have more to do with which part of the nervous system is wounded or injured, rather than what this specific type of injury is. Okay. So how a brain tumor manifests really depends on where in the brain it is. If it's in particular parts of the brain, it might manifest with seizures, it might manifest with headaches, it might affect someone's vision or their language or their strength. And it really depends on where in those kind of complex structures of the brain it arises.
Okay. Maria de Jesus from Montgomery County Library is saying, is there something within the book that you would like to further study or look into that you haven't gotten around to yet?
Yes, just about every sentence of the book, I was like, let me put a pin in this. I could write an entire book about this one thing. So thanks to the library and all of the research I was able to do. So yes, many, many kind of moments in the book that I think I would love to flesh out someday.
Is that what some of the footnotes were about? Like you adding more context there?
Yes. I was really lucky to have an editor who allowed me to put in many footnotes, because I had so many asides I wanted to include.
What's one thing that you would be the first thing that you would explore further?
Again, my background and training is in neurologic complications of infectious diseases. I think those are really fascinating because they intersect with people's life stories in really profound ways. So sometimes in order to make a diagnosis, I have to know the particular migration journey someone took to get to the United States and what terrain they traveled, because their illness is a fungus that only lives in the soil of this particular desert. Wow. So I really love, so there are a few moments where I talk about neurologic infections, but I would love to be able to, I feel like there are many stories that are kind of buried in that space that I would love to be able to kind of research more and tell more.
Great. Venetia from Phoenix Public Library is asking, what are you most looking forward to readers getting out of your book?
The main thing I hope readers take from this is that this is not intended to be sort of voyeuristic, like look at these strange symptoms. The idea is that each of these different experiences tells us something universal about the human experience. So I hope that every reader looks at this book and sees something of themselves in it, just as I put a lot of myself into it.
Mm-hmm. Any advice for other aspiring medical students, neurologists, authors?
I would say just know that sometimes we get it wrong. Everyone does. We have for all of our history. And that's okay. What matters is that you learn to be open to rewriting the stories that you're telling.
Mm-hmm. And really quick, we have a lot of people asking, we've had a lot of questions come in about AI. So I'm going to ask Hector's question, and then I'll ask the last question of the day. Hector from Yonkers Public Library says, will AI someday replicate the circuitry of the brain? What is your opinion here?
This is such a hard question. I feel like I've been asked a lot of questions about AI talking about this book, and I really need to become better informed. I think what I have to say is that there's so many aspects. I hear a lot of people talking about how AI is this black box, and we don't really understand the circuitry of how a lot of these LLMs are doing the calculations that they're doing, or how they're coming up with the responses that they are. But I feel like the same thing is true of the human brain. And I think what's really fascinating is that we're now starting to learn a little bit about AI from the mistakes it's making, AI hallucinations and confabulations. And they feel to me very reminiscent of the mistakes the human brain makes. So I will say that to say that I think we know little enough about how the circuitry of the human brain gives rise to consciousness and experience that I don't even know that we would be able to identify if AI had reached that particular mechanism.
That's scary.
Okay, so we're doomed.
The question that we love to close with every author talk, what are you reading right now that you suggest everyone run out to the library and check out immediately?
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to very briefly plug two things. So one is the thing I love about libraries is I feel like in the internet era, it's really hard to experience like serendipity when you can order any book online. And I feel like that's what's so beautiful about libraries. So I wanted to share a book that I recently reread that I first discovered on the shelves of the Baltimore Public Library because it was a librarian's like curated choice. And I was about to visit the Pacific Northwest and I wanted to read a book that was set in the Pacific Northwest. And I found this one at the very front at the library in kind of a curated section of librarians' choices. This is called The Geek Love, and it is this really strange, remarkable story about family and about magic and about bodies that is also really about gives a sense of place. So anyone who's in the Pacific Northwest, if you haven't read this book, I think it is a window into how things that are fictional or fantastical can really reveal something true. And then I think
by Catherine Dunn, you said?
Yes, by Catherine Dunn, exactly. Yes, it is. It's a very memorable cover, I think. But originally found, and please excuse my phone. This is originally found in the Baltimore Public Library. And then I thought it would be really dishonest if I didn't also share a children's book because I have toddlers, 1.5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and we read a lot of picture books. So this is a book that my sister just sent me. It's called Milo Imagines the World. And I feel like one of the things I love about public libraries is that they are these like public open spaces where people get to intersect with the stories of other people that they would otherwise never be in the same space as. And that's what this book is about. It's about the same thing happening on public transit and imagining someone else's life on public transit. It's about a little boy. My kids are obsessed with it and they have drawn their own imagination stories all over it. Wow. But I highly encourage that if you have toddlers, go out and borrow this book from your public library.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. The last hour has flown by. It's been such a pleasure talking to you for the last hour. Thank you for your beautiful book and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and for reading it so carefully, and to all of the viewers for taking the time.
Yeah, and with that, I also want to extend a huge thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, in the resources area, you can find a link to order Priya's book, so make sure you check that out. We look forward to everyone joining us next week to chat with a Smithsonian scientist about the stories, science, and history of birds. Be sure to register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.